In 1959, a sparsely populated area of New Jersey was chosen as the location for a new airport. It was to be the world's largest jetport, designed for the latest technology in air travel and covering 10,000 acres of wetlands. It was a vision of progress promoted by the power brokers of the day, government agencies, industry, and politicians. But there was something the power brokers didn't expect, an opposition with a way of life to protect and their own vision of the meaning of progress.
Think about what was going on in the 60s with air quality being noticeably bad, water quality being terrible, and people were beginning to get upset with what was going on in the environment.
What was at stake? The way of life of tens of thousands of people.
Basically, this area would have been destroyed. We would have been totally obliterated, would have obliterated the Great Swamp.
This is the story of the grassroots effort to save a little-known place called the Great Swamp, and the 9-year fight that began in a local high school and escalated all the way to the United States Congress. The area known as the Great Swamp is located only 26 miles from New York City, in the middle of New Jersey, the most densely populated state in America. Historically, the Great Swamp was viewed as a mosquito-infested obstacle, a place to be drained, cut down, filled in, farmed, anything but preserved.
Years ago, wetlands were not well understood, the values of wetlands. They were considered wastelands, mosquito-breeding, nasty areas, scary. So let's fill them in, let's drain them.
Geologically, the Great Swamp was formed by the retreating Wisconsin Glacier about 14,000 years ago, its melting waters overflowing into a basin that became Lake Passaic. As the lake drained, what remained was the Passaic River and the shallow water that became the Great Swamp.
A swamp is basically a forested wetland. The Great Swamp is a basin about 3 by 5 miles. There are open, grassy wetlands. There are also some upland forests and fields and streams and brooks that meander through it, ponds scattered throughout. So there's a variety of habitats for a wide variety of species.
Archaeological evidence shows that the first settlers were natives, Paleo-Indians, and later, the Lenape tribe.
Native people lived here for 12,000 years. Even if you dropped 1 spear point a year, that's 12,000 spear points. So you see, you can imagine the amount of artifacts that were found right around the Great Swamp. The Great Swamp, to them, was a place that you feel at home. You learn to use it, to share it, to thank it for being a provider for you. There was such an abundance here.
After a half-century of Dutch settlement, land rights around the Great Swamp were delegated to an assortment of British royalty, and in the early 1700s, some small villages and hamlets began to spring up at the edge of the wetlands.
There were several logging mills, and there were homes scattered throughout the swamp, homesteads and farms.
In 1777, during the American Revolution, George Washington's troops marched north after successful battles at Trenton and Princeton, looking for a defensible winter encampment, and ended up in Morristown, a few miles from the Great Swamp.
And one of the reasons Washington selected this area was he had hills at his back. The British were in New York City, and he had a nice moat in front of him between the British, and that was the Great Swamp.
After the Revolution, and for the next 100 years, the booming lumber industry cleared the landscape both in and around the swamp. Open areas became farmland, and some orchards were planted. By the late 1800s, the woods were gone, and as a result, flooding became a problem. Engineers proposed ways to make the area productive again. One report, written in 1869, was titled, "On the Condition and Proper Mode of Effectually Draining the Great Swamp in the Counties of Morris and Somerset, New Jersey." An impressive title, but nothing came of it. As time went on, the swamp continued to be viewed as an unfit place that needed to be changed for whatever current industry demanded. In the 1930s, government relief programs stepped in. The Civilian Conservation Corps built an encampment near the swamp and constructed drainage ditches in an attempt to reduce flooding and help farming. But farming was hard, and many farmers gave up and moved away. As the second and third growth of trees matured, shrubs took root, paths filled in, and nature began taking over again. By the 1940s and 50s, many of the farmhouses were occupied by non-farming families, including Arthur and Helen Fensky and their 3 children.
I was a farm boy to start off with. It was after I had served in the Army and got married. We found a place in Green Village, which was owned by a wagon maker and a farmer. And it was an old house that needed quite a few things done.
The Great Swamp was really where we lived, because there was no borderline between what was swamp and what was our backyards.
I grew up in the Great Swamp, running around barefoot with my friends. We didn't appreciate it as a swamp even. It was the woods, and there were roads, and there were open areas that we knew.
I loved growing up where we did. We had enough neighbors so that there were kids around. We could get games together and things like that. And we could go bog hopping, and we could catch frogs, and we could have great adventures.
While the small towns near the swamp continued to grow, some of the larger properties and farms had become country estates for wealthy businessmen who commuted to New York City.
In Harding Township, there were about 4,000 residents in 1959. Not much different than what's here now. They just loved their way of life. It was an agricultural-based economy, large farms, local farmers, and the great estates like the Freelandheisens, the Ballantines, they supported a lot of the local economy.
In the Great Swamp, the intense development affecting most communities surrounding New York did not occur. The towns and village centers around the swamp retained the tranquil air of colonial America. The semi-rural, Main Street-oriented, neighborly world of post office, church, and village store. The jet age, superhighways, and the crush of modern life were not part of the local lifestyle. It was hard to believe that New York City was just 26 miles away. Life and commerce there were supported by an immense infrastructure and transportation system, serving international trade and millions of commuters and residents. The power brokers behind it were the transportation agencies with broad corporate and political influence. The Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, run by Robert Moses, and the Port Authority of New York, headed by Austin Tobin. Between them, they built or controlled almost all the bridges, tunnels, bus terminals, ports, and airports in the region. Using eminent domain, they sometimes bulldozed entire neighborhoods for huge civil engineering projects, including the Cross Bronx Expressway and areas surrounding the George Washington Bridge and Lincoln Tunnel. What's more, the Port Authority of New York, formed in 1921 during the Progressive Era, had broad powers in both New York and New Jersey, although limited to a 25-mile radius from the Statue of Liberty.
The Port Authority, as it was designed, was a bi-state agency, one that would be insulated from local politics, and therefore it would fit the Progressive Era's theme that if you want to get important projects done, you need to do it without having politicians continually interfere.
In the past decade, the Port of New York Authority, the self-supporting agency of the states of New York and New Jersey, has invested over $50 million in new and improved terminal projects
This is the world's largest bus terminal. Built at the cost of $24 million, it occupies a full block on Manhattan's 8th Avenue.
There was occasional friction between the local officials and the Port Authority, in part because the Port Authority was taking over land to build the bus terminal or an entrance for the George Washington Bridge. But there was a general feeling that the Port Authority's activities were going to be helpful to the region and to the local governments.
In the 1940s and 50s, with millions of dollars of revenues from bonds and tolls, the Port Authority was able to control or finance new projects they deemed essential to the region, including the 3 major airports: Newark, just across the Hudson River in New Jersey, LaGuardia in Queens, New York, and Idlewild, also known as New York International, and later renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport.
Flight time at a busy airport as the big plane rolls slowly and gracefully into loading position.
As the 1950s unfolded, civilian and commercial air travel became more viable. It was heavily promoted as safe and enjoyable, and the volume of travelers increased. It was the dawn of the jet age, and technology evolved so quickly that the world could scarcely keep up.
Now, in our lifetime, comes one of those rare moments when a great door swings open and man enters a new age, the age of the jet.
As the 1950s drew to a close, the major airlines scrambled to add jets to their fleets. However, most airports were not capable of handling the new technology. Runways needed to be longer and stronger to bear the additional weight. The skies were getting crowded, and the air traffic control system was inadequate.
56 lives are lost when an unscheduled airliner crashes in flames in the shallow Elizabeth River at Elizabeth, New Jersey. That night, mid the wreckage of the plane, which had left Newark Airport only 7 minutes before crashing, firemen searched for bodies. All aboard, including 4 children, were killed.
The scene in Brooklyn, New York, like an awful page out of the Blitz which wartime London knew. This is what confronted investigators probing the nation's worst air disaster. The jet was supposed to have circled in a holding pattern over New Jersey, awaiting clearance to make its approach to Idlewild Airport. Its mid-air collision with a super constellation took the lives of all 128 persons aboard the planes.
With grim disasters occurring all too often and intense pressures on the existing airports, the Port Authority needed to address the problems. The solution they determined was to build another major airport. The question was, where should it be built?
When the Port Authority began to look at places where it could put a new jetport, it studied about 15 different locations, and it decided that most of them were not going to be very satisfactory. Some were too close to the existing lines of planes that would come in to Newark Airport particularly. Others were subject to flooding because there's a lot of low land in that area, and some of them were just too far away. The Great Swamp had a double advantage. One, it wasn't very far away. It was just outside the 25-mile zone. And secondly, it was a swamp. And in the late 1950s, a swamp was something you wanted to avoid or get rid of. It had snakes, it had other things that at that time, before the environmental movement changed our understanding of what a swamp might be, it was something that one could easily build on, cover up, and there were not very many people there.
We were quite close to the swamp. We didn't really think about that when we bought. We simply found a nice old house and got busy painting. We closed probably in the beginning of November '59. And there we were, happy little young family.
Well, the Port Authority's general strategy, which had been very useful, was to bring in the newspaper editors and reporters, make them aware of a proposed project, and persuade them that, in fact, that project deserved their full support. The largest and most influential newspaper in the state at the time was the Newark Evening News. And so in November of 1959, the Port Authority's leaders met with the news editors and attempted to persuade them that this was a project deserving its full endorsement. Well, within a few days, the editors decided that they weren't sure if it deserved their full endorsement, but it certainly deserved to be a front-page story.
The Newark Evening News was how everyone found out about it. It was on December 3rd, 1959. The Port Authority of New York was proposing building a 10,000-acre jetport in the heart of Morris County.
We said, what? Can we believe this? How could this be? We were shocked. We were mystified. We were bewildered.
In the coming weeks, the Jetport story was front-page news almost every day. The Port Authority issued reports and statements explaining their plan, which only made matters worse.
This wasn't just any airport. This was 4 12,000-foot runways. Most people were wondering, what are they thinking? Where is this going?
There was a small map on the front page, and the small map showed that our house would be a control tower.
Almost half the size of Manhattan Island, the Jetport would be designed to accommodate a new generation of aircraft that would be in service by the mid-1960s, such as the Boeing 727 and Douglas DC-9. These jets burn more than 1,000 gallons of fuel on takeoff and produce so much pollution and noise that the Federal Aviation Administration recommended a distance of 5 miles from the start of takeoff to the nearest town. At least 4 towns would be obliterated, along with the Great Swamp.
Basically, this area would have been destroyed. We would have destroyed one of the most remarkable natural assets in this part of the country, and I don't think life would ever be the same.
Less than a week after the news broke, a full-page announcement for a meeting organized by residents appeared in the local paper. On December 18, 1959, more than 1,000 people showed up at the Madison High School. The crowd overflowed into the lobby, cafeterias, and classrooms. People brought posters and signs condemning the Jetport, and numerous speakers denounced the destruction it would bring. One of the most outspoken opponents was Congressman Peter Frelinghuysen, whose family had lived in New Jersey since before the American Revolution.
My father was elected in 1952, so he'd represented this area for a long time. He was aware of the value of the swamp. All I know, he was the ultimate gentleman. But this is one of the things that really drove him to quite a lot of anger. So he was very much, uncharacteristically involved in this issue, because basically the Port Authority said, New Jersey, you're going to take it whether you like it or not.
Hundreds of individuals fired off protest letters to the governor and officials expressing shock at the potential loss of their cherished homes and neighborhoods. One telegram was signed Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Fensky, perhaps their first action against the Jetport. Throughout December, politicians and businessmen had meetings with the Port Authority, including one with Austin Tobin and his deputy, in an attempt to dissuade them from their plans.
Austin Tobin, he was a stubborn guy, and he had the sense that this was a set of wrong-headed people, enthusiastic, maybe thought they knew what they were doing, but what they were doing is blocking an important achievement, that is the development of another airport.
Attending the meeting was George K. Batt, who had served as mayor of Montclair and president of the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce. Immediately after the meeting, Batt sent a strong letter to Austin Tobin, advising him to choose an alternate location. "I'm afraid, Mr. Tobin," wrote Batt, "you are like the boy who put his finger in the hornet's nest. And by the time you take it out, perhaps you wish you had never heard of Morris County." In a 3-page response 1 week later, Tobin took it as a threat. It became clear that this was going to be a protracted fight, and that the Jetport opposition would need to organize. By late December of 1959, the Jersey Jetport Site Association, or JJSA, was formed, consisting of a group of federal, state, and local politicians led by Congressman Frelinghuysen.
Congressman Peter Frelinghuysen had his contacts in Washington, D.C., and the hope, of course, was to get Congress to be agitated about this.
They rented a space, hired an office staff, and bought newspaper ads in a concerted effort to raise funds. 8,500 contributions poured in, averaging $25 and ranging from $2,000 to 10 cents from the piggy bank of a 6-year-old.
There is a wonderful map with circles all around it, put out by the Jersey Jetport Site Association, that shows how many communities, established communities, not just little estates, but villages and towns would be affected.
Not everyone in the community was against the Jetport. One resident said, "We don't care one way or the other whether they put it there or don't put it there. You usually can't stop progress." Another felt that the airport would be good for the area. It would eliminate the mosquito problem. On January 18, 1960, important action was taking place in the state legislature. The New Jersey Senate voted 20-1 to pass a resolution opposing a new major air terminal in Morris County. The following day, the entire 14-member New Jersey congressional delegation backed the resolution.
Congressman Frelinghuysen thought that he had the Department of the Interior interested enough, and he made the pronouncement that the Jetport is dead. Well, that wasn't exactly true.
There's no question that the Port Authority had developed over a period of decades a reputation based substantially on reality that when it proposed a project, that project was likely to be carried out. There was no feeling in 1959, 1960 that there was going to be significant enough opposition to block a major airport in northern New Jersey. That was a surprise.
To be able to proceed with the Jetport, the Port Authority needed to expand its jurisdiction beyond the 25-mile radius from the Statue of Liberty, and the Great Swamp was located at mile 26.
Because the Port Authority had this plan outside of its region, it needed a positive vote from the two state legislatures, both New York and New Jersey, and also support from the two governors. Once the New Jersey Senate opposed it, it seemed clear that the Port Authority wasn't going to get its Great Swamp Airport. But that did not lead it to stop a sustained effort to show that the Great Swamp was the only location in which a large airport could be built.
Despite the Senate vote, the Port Authority divulged that it would continue to study Morris County as its first choice for the new Jetport, and issued reports about why the Great Swamp was the ideal location.
Both Governor Rockefeller and Governor Minor had a wait-and-see attitude towards whether to support the airport or not. They felt that Morris County was undeveloped. They felt it was backwater. They felt it needed jobs.
Given the Port Authority's reputation and the governor's non-committal position, the Jersey Jetport Site Association believed that the agency's tactics were not to be trusted. Throughout 1960, the JJSA distributed publicity materials urging residents to stay alert and spread the word. "Don't swallow Tobin tranquilizers," cautioned one handout. Frelinghuysen and the New Jersey members of Congress soon opened another line of attack, encouraging Congressman Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn to launch a federal probe into the Port Authority's policies and integrity, and subpoenaed the agency's files. When Tobin refused to cooperate, he was cited for contempt of Congress and indicted in August of 1960. The story of the Jetport was now national news. Although the investigation absorbed Tobin's time and energy, the Port Authority's experts continued to analyze the Great Swamp as the likely Jetport site and paid 19 homeowners for permission to do test borings on their private property. When they refused to disclose the property owners' names, George Batt demanded that the veil of secrecy be lifted as a matter of public trust. Austin Tobin promptly replied that secrecy was required to protect the property owners from harassment. It seemed that Tobin had his mind set, determined that nothing would get in his way. In September of 1960, a significant event had occurred as quietly as possible in the clerk's office at the Morris County Courthouse. A local lawyer filed papers that would transfer almost 1,000 acres of land in the middle of the Great Swamp to the U.S. Department of the Interior for use as a wildlife sanctuary. Of those involved in the land transfer, the newspapers hinted that the individual behind it was Marcellus Hartley Dodge, one of the largest landowners in the Great Swamp area. He was the retired chairman of the board of the Remington Arms Company, formed by his grandfather in 1888. The company manufactured sporting rifles and later supplied arms to the Allies in World War I and World War II.
Marcy Dodge was my godfather. I knew him very well. I used to play in this house. He was a lifelong conservationist. My mother always said that he was sort of a tortured soul because here he was, the owner and chairman of Remington Arms. He loved animals, and he didn't hunt. As he used to say to his friends, "I shoot to miss." So he'd always go out on these hunting parties and grouse shooting and whatever else, but Marcy Dodge never hit a thing.
Dodge loved this area. He loved this whole part of the state and the whole area, and he thought it would be destroyed, and it would have been destroyed by creation of a jetport right in the midst of it. And one day, Mr. Dodge came down to see us, very concerned, and he said, "Gentlemen, the Port Authority of New York wants to build a jetport in my backyard, and we really have to come up with some way to stop that." And I was a young 29-year-old attorney when this was going on, and he was a man in his 80s. You know, when you're fresh out of law school, you know more law than you're ever going to know the rest of your life. So I did research and found that, yes, indeed, the Port Authority, being an agent of the state, could condemn property just as the state could condemn it and take it. The limitation, however, was that it could not take land which was owned by the federal government. So I wrote a 20-page memo concluding that in order to stop the Port Authority from building a jetport out here, we had to turn those lands over to the federal government. And Mr. Dodge took that, and he just led the campaign. It was his thing in life from that time on to make sure that that happened.
He had the passion, and he had the money. He donated to the entire fight, but he did more than that. He got in his horse and buggy, and he went and approached some of the farmers personally and entered into contracts with them one-on-one.
Dodge persuaded his neighbors that the best move was to acquire land in strategic places in the middle of the proposed jetport, then give that land to an agency willing to maintain it for conservation purposes. It was his quiet campaign that convinced 15 of his neighbors to sell their land so that it could be donated to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that September day in the Morris County Courthouse.
He wanted this part of the state to be beautiful as it always was, not only for him, but for all the people who resided in this area. And he thought he was leading a crusade on behalf of those people.
Dodge was not alone. For a number of years, the preservation of the wilderness areas in the Great Swamp had been a dream of organizations and nature lovers who hoped to save the area from all forms of development.
The Great Swamp was a lot of things, but one thing it wasn't was a dedicated wildlife refuge. There was a movement to acquire land in the Great Swamp before the controversy erupted. An organization by the name of Wildlife Preserves Incorporated had acquired some property here in an effort to protect natural areas in New Jersey. But there was no concentrated effort by a public agency or even a public group.
Dr. Robert Zook and his wife Florence teach botany at Drew University, not far from here.
Nearby educational institutions offered botany and zoology programs and viewed the swamp as a living laboratory where they conducted field trips to study plants and animals. Garden clubs and civic associations were vocal jetport opponents, offering ways for people to share and protect their way of life. And numerous local residents were actively involved. Grace Hand was educated in biology and ornithology and understood the science behind the Great Swamp.
Grace Hand was one of the women who explained to us why the Great Swamp was important, because she was so knowledgeable about the swamp. There were certain people, environmentalists and ecologists, who had studied the Great Swamp all their lives. They were the ones who told us that this was a natural basin. This was a place where all the heavy rains, all the quick snow melts could just be soaked up like a sponge and prevent flooding downstream. We could not destroy that.
With the Jetport threat a dramatic catalyst, the numerous groups that wanted to see the Great Swamp saved joined hands and began to strategize. The biggest challenge, raising the money to purchase land in addition to the 1,000 acres donated through the efforts of Marcellus Hartley Dodge. But before people donate money, they reasoned, they want to know what it's for. And it was going to be for the Great Swamp itself, as the largest unspoiled remnant of Lake Passaic, a major resting and feeding area for waterfowl and birds along the Atlantic Flyway, to protect the water quality in the heavily populated areas downstream, and for the benefits of open space for human enjoyment. These themes were rarely heard before by the public. Should an area like the Great Swamp be destroyed, it could never be replaced. With no talk of runways or landing patterns, not even money, they began a push to educate and inform the public.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
1961 was an eventful year for America, New Jersey, and the battle to defeat the Jetport. John F. Kennedy would begin his presidency with a new Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, an ardent conservationist. Governor Minor of New Jersey would reach the end of his second term. And Alston Tobin was facing contempt charges for refusing to submit documents to the Congressional Judiciary Committee about the Port Authority's operations. And yet the Port Authority persisted. In May, it released a 170-page report discussing additional possible sites for a jetport, but it seemed they still had their eye on the Great Swamp.
Well, the Port Authority was, in some sense, you could say, mentally and emotionally stuck with the Great Swamp by the time you got to 1960, 61. The environmental movement, which was beginning to arise, was not something that the Port Authority was sensitive to, was thinking about, and so the agency was, in a sense, an important sense, caught without really understanding the developing effort that was going to stop it.
Anti-Jetport forces in the surrounding towns released their own comprehensive technical reports written by aviation experts. One concluded that an additional jetport was not needed and that the Port Authority's analysis was faulty. Another stressed the magnitude of the adverse effects that building a jetport would have around the Great Swamp.
The Great Swamp is in the lower portion of a 55-square-mile watershed made up entirely of Harding Township and portions of 9 other municipalities. Because this is a floodplain, they would have to drain the swamp, but knock off some of the surrounding hillsides and use that for fill. So that would totally change the nature of not just the swamp, but all of the surrounding areas.
While the Port Authority and JJSA pursued their agendas, the numerous conservation groups concerned with preserving the Great Swamp began to coalesce. One organization became official in March of 1961, the Great Swamp Committee of the North American Wildlife Foundation, with Marcellus Hartley Dodge as one of its 2 honorary chairmen. Helen Fensky, the homemaker from Green Village, was appointed secretary.
She was a stay-at-home mother, but clearly that was not all that she wanted to be. She had bigger fish to fry.
I met Helen by volunteering, and I became a very good friend and a fan of hers because she was just such a dynamic woman.
Lacking in office space or adequate funds, the committee's first activities took place in the kitchen of her Green Village home on the edge of the swamp.
There was a small group of people got around the kitchen table. My kitchen table is famous. Everything. You know, it's fine to fight it, but you have to have something to replace it with. I mean, you just can't oppose it. And that is when the concept of trying to establish a national wildlife refuge here began.
I worked there, and I was doing any kind of odd job that needed to be done. Stuffing envelopes, licking stamps, running errands.
Many volunteers were newcomers assigned to hand out publicity materials and give walking tours and presentations.
The Great Swamp Committee was not as effective in the beginning because they didn't know how to do it. These were very inexperienced ladies, and you can make leaflets and you can send mailings, and you know what happens to mailings. They get dropped into the wastebasket or whatever.
Throughout 1961, the Great Swamp Committee polished its presentation and continued to familiarize the community with the science behind the swamp. And they began to explore the best ways to preserve it, with Helen Fenske in a prominent role.
We watched our mother grow in this passion of hers, first to deal with neighbors, then to deal with well-heeled donors and politicians and state officials and national officials, and all this with a high school graduation and not a lot of education otherwise. Once she grabbed onto this project, she did lots and lots of reading. She did her homework, and she became an expert.
You have to be ready when the time is right, when the politics are right, when people are excited about a particular issue or thing. So you have to be prepared to seize the moment, and Helen was right there.
The moment came when the committee had an opportunity to promote its cause to John Gottschalk, the regional director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Boston. He was impressed. A gift of 2,000 acres, he offered, would be enough for the Fish and Wildlife Service to begin active management, and 3,000 acres would guarantee a national wildlife refuge. With the Port Authority ever in the background, political opposition continued to grow. On June 3rd, the New Jersey legislature passed Senate Bill 218, prohibiting establishment of a jetport in Morris or 6 other New Jersey counties. But to become law, it required the signature of Governor Minor. A staunch union supporter and advocate for workers, Governor Minor was popular in New Jersey. Although his public stand on the jetport was undecided, his tours promoting the airlines, marriage to an airlines marketing executive, and long-standing friendship with Austin Tobin seemed to support an endorsement of the Port Authority's plans. For months he had been saying that he'd wait until all the facts were in. Now he could delay no longer, and he set July 12, 1961 as the date for a public hearing. When the day arrived, 15 buses and private cars carried 1,200 people to Trenton for the governor's hearing. The audience swelled the visitors' gallery and back of the assembly chamber, overflowing into the Senate chamber and corridors. In a story that made the front page of the New York Times, demonstrators, many of whom were women, paraded their placards outside the State House. "Don't confuse me with facts. My mind is made up," read one poster, signed Bob Minor. It was the first time that all the anti-jetport forces came together to make their voices heard, and it was raucous. Governor Minor publicly admitted his bias. He believed the jetport was in the best interests of New Jersey and would bring jobs and economic growth.
The only group that was in favor, any major group, was the AFL-CIO, who said jobs. This will bring jobs. The local chambers of commerce had a totally different point of view. They would lose their small businesses.
The governor and Peter Frelinghuysen went head-to-head. A free-swinging verbal scrap, the newspaper called it.
My father had a definite negative opinion of Bob Minor on many scores, but certainly his position on the Great Swamp against the wishes of his constituents in so many groups in northern New Jersey was a political moment, a huge political moment, and I think did a lot of damage to the minor reputation.
6 weeks later, the governor returned Senate Bill 218 without his signature. The 10-page veto leaned on the Port Authority and FAA arguments in favor of a jetport in Morris County. In his veto message, he wrote, "The issue is too important to be decided in an atmosphere of panic and false fears." At the end of 1961, Robert Minor left office upon completing his second term. The incoming Governor Richard J. Hughes promised to oppose the jetport in the Great Swamp. That December, the Jersey Jetport Site Association announced that it was winding down. They had played the crucial role of halting the Port Authority's steamroller, and in doing so made the conservation work of the Great Swamp Committee possible. Although the conservationists were far from their goal, more than 1,200 individuals and 100 organizations had contributed enough money and land to bring the total to over 2,000 acres. True to their word, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service opened a field office in November 1961, with the Bureau's flying goose symbol prominently displayed on a sign outside the door, assuring the government's active interest. By the spring of 1962, the Great Swamp Committee had not yet reached its 3,000-acre goal, but it did outgrow Helen Fenskey's kitchen and was moved to a tiny room above the New Vernon Post Office. In addition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the committee had gained the support of prominent educators, scientists, and the leaders of major institutions, including the Audubon Society, Drew University, and the College of St. Elizabeth. With another 900 acres still to be obtained, something really big was needed to convince the remaining doubters. When Stuart Udall was appointed the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, he was writing what would become his bestseller, The Quiet Crisis, an early warning against the indiscriminate destruction of landscape in the name of progress.
I would credit Stuart Udall with convincing the federal government and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take on the Great Swamp as sort of a new way of looking at wildlife refuges. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had not had the experience of having a refuge in an area that was highly populated and that was quite urbanized. At that point, this was really precedent-setting.
At the invitation of the Great Swamp Committee, Udall visited the area and attended a dinner in his honor where Marcellus Hartley Dodge would present the Department of the Interior with a deed for the 2,000 acres obtained so far.
I'll always remember it. Mr. Dodge sat with me at the dinner, and then he got up, and Mr. Udall was at another table, and he got up, and they walked together towards the center of the room, and Mr. Dodge handed him the deed.
In his remarks, the Secretary promised to declare the area a national wildlife refuge when the goal of 3,000 acres was reached. A strong ally was now behind the effort to preserve the Great Swamp. On June 7, 1963, the region's airports experienced the first of a series of Black Fridays. There were 2-hour delays. Planes were stacked 18 layers deep, using all 3 holding patterns. In the backlash that followed, the Port Authority and Federal Aviation Administration started pressing again for a new jetport and appeared teamed together in a push for the Great Swamp. All of this served to motivate the Great Swamp Committee to take a different tack. They created an ambitious gift table and concentrated on big donors, philanthropists, foundations, and corporations. Now on salary, Helen Fenskey's PR abilities were put to the test.
She knew that the only way to save the swamp was to get public opinion going in her direction. And so she cultivated newspapers and, anybody who had access to mass media.
Word spread, and after touring the area, New York Times reporter Brooks Atkinson wrote a column about their efforts. It was the kind of reporting fundraisers dream about: correct facts, admiring an optimistic tone, and a cautionary conclusion. The Great Swamp is still the most convenient location for an airport, he wrote, but the Great Swamp has friends in far places. This was something that Kate Bradshaw, a committee member and close friend of Helen Fenske, would soon discover firsthand.
Kate Bradshaw was opening the mail one day in this crummy little office, and she opened the envelope and gave a gasp and gave my mother a check. And my mother looked at it and said, "Oh, wow, $5,000, this is wonderful." Well, Kate said, "No, it's not $5,000. Take a look at it again." It was $50,000, and it was totally unsolicited. And I remember this as being a watershed event. This was so much money that was donated just out of the blue, and it showed that they were really gaining a worldwide audience.
On Christmas Day, 1963, Marcellus Hartley Dodge died.
I was in touch with him pretty regularly in the last months of his life, and then I got word that he had died on Christmas Day, and I remember that. And for me, it was an end of a strong relationship, and I enjoyed working for him. I did a lot for him. I felt it when he died. I'd lost a good friend.
In relating the story of his life and accomplishments, the New York Times obituary made no mention of his activities to help save the Great Swamp. It remained the well-kept secret of a quiet man, part of a legacy soon to be realized. By the spring of 1964, it became clear that Stuart Udall could declare the Great Swamp a wildlife refuge by secretarial order, and that the present acreage could operate as a refuge. In a hastily prepared invitation, an event to dedicate the land as a wildlife refuge was announced for May 29, 1964, at the Marcellus Hartley Dodge estate. It was a beautiful day, and more than 1,000 people gathered for the celebration. Helen Fenske, her children, and their friends greeted the guests, including Stuart Udall, who flew in from Washington.
So the helicopter lands with Stuart Udall in, and I don't know who Stuart Udall is, but I understand that he's very important, and I am to go shake his hand. I greeted him under the chopper blades, and he had bent over to just come down to my level, but I thought he was bending over because of the blades. And so I bent over too, thinking that, okay, the blades are gonna cut my head off.
Officials and dignitaries crowded the speaker's platform, including Peter Frelinghuysen, John Gottschalk, and Governor Hughes. They formally presented the Department of the Interior with a gift of 2,600 acres worth over $1 million to form the nucleus of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. As thousands listened over the radio, Secretary Udall observed, "It is inspiring to realize that 462 organizations and 6,100 individuals representing 286 towns and 29 states have helped raise the money to save the Great Swamp."
There was definitely a sense that this is winnable. I think people felt that we could just a little bit more effort, a little bit more publicity, a little bit more something, and the Port Authority will go away.
The Jetport had not been stopped. That was a bit of a ruse. They were trying to convince the Port Authority to go away, that they had the land tied up, but they didn't have the land tied up properly.
Mr. Tobin was smart enough to stay quiet for a while and then actively, bring out another consultant's report. And obviously, Great Swamp was still number one.
In 1966, the Port Authority issued yet another report stating it would appear that much of the land on or near an airport on the Great Swamp site could continue to serve as a wildlife preserve, just as at other major airports in the country.
The puzzle that an observer has, and I'm sure that the people who live through this in the Great Swamp area have, is why did the Port Authority continue to battle not only in 1959-60, by 61 it was clear to an objective observer that they weren't going to get an airport there. But of course, the people in the Great Swamp saw the Port Authority continue to issue reports to identify the weaknesses of other possible sites. And so in 64 and 66, you had further Port Authority reports. And that no doubt made the folks who lived in the Great Swamp area nervous that maybe the agency could in fact do what it wanted to do.
The mid-1960s were marked by a remarkable birth of national environmental awareness. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, took the country by storm, warning of the dangers to all natural systems by the misuse of chemical pesticides. And a hard-fought conservation battle ended in Washington when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Wilderness Act on September 3, 1964, after 8 years of public hearings, debates, and strong controversy.
The Wilderness Act is the highest form of land preservation in the nation. And they said, well, if we can get some of the refuge designated as wilderness, you can't have permanent man-made structures. And that would be the final nail in the coffin of the Port Authority.
The Wilderness Act gave Congress 10 years to decide which areas could receive wilderness status. How could the Great Swamp possibly qualify?
The mindset for wilderness was large, pristine, undisturbed areas, and Great Swamp was not that. There were roads and bridges and buildings and backyard dumps and drained wetlands. So it was a real challenge. Congressman Peter Frelinghuysen was the legislative champion in that effort.
Alongside Peter Frelinghuysen at many hearings was Helen Fenske, who helped move the proposal through Washington, D.C.
And so through a long process, which involved considerable public input and tremendous public support, the wilderness proposal was advanced. The resource held true that we really did have an area of sufficient biological and ecological quality that it would qualify for wilderness.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Great Swamp Wilderness Act, and it was done.
The governor is my superior officer. I have no comment whatsoever.
Well, Mr. Tobin, does the Port Authority intend to go ahead with its plans to seek an alternative site for an airport?
Port Authority is available for any public service in the field of transportation that our two governors wishes to attempt.
The contempt citation against Alston Tobin was dismissed upon appeal. And with the Great Swamp permanently unobtainable, the Port Authority continued its search for a location elsewhere.
And that you're going to meet objections wherever a jetport is proposed.
Alston Tobin could not hide his lingering resentment.
The governor is my superior officer, and I report to the governor.
Did you read the Roman report, though?
Yes, I've read it all.
What was your reaction?
I have no comment whatsoever.
This is the irony behind the entire Jetport battle. If it weren't for Alston Tobin, there would be no Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. It was the fight itself that led to its preservation.
As it turned out, the Port Authority was wrong, and the technical report released 8 years earlier by anti-Jetport forces was true. The actual number of passengers would be half what the Port Authority had claimed. Other major cities would develop their own facilities. The existing airports were expanded, and with new technology like jumbo jets and more efficient fueling, a new jetport would not be needed at all.
Welcome to Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and thank you for being part of this historic event.
50 years ago today, President Johnson signed the Wilderness Act and the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, two of the most important conservation laws in the history of our nation. Since the passage of those acts, the National Wilderness Preservation System has grown to more than 109 million acres. Over 70 million of those acres are within the Department of the Interior, with the very first 3,660 acres right here at Great Swamp.
You know, it's probably not the place people anticipate when we talk about wilderness. New Jersey, 26 miles away from Times Square, as I understand, which is pretty extraordinary. But what a special place, what an important place to tell a story about wilderness. 244 bird species make this refuge home, at least in transit, if not a permanent home. That is incredible.
Preserving and protecting the Great Swamp has been an ongoing project for decades. It's grown from the original 2,600 acres to almost 7,800 acres. It has basically tripled in size. This growth reflects the vision of people 50 years ago who saved the swamp.
Well, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that what happened at Great Swamp was precedent-setting, and that it led to successes in other places around the country who follow the Great Swamp model.
It was part of a movement in the 60s that led to Earth Day in 1970, that led to the Clean Water Act, that led to the Clean Air Act, that led to a number of preservation efforts nationwide.
I think the message then hasn't changed, and that is that we need to protect the mothership. We need to protect our environment for us to have healthy, good lives, and that includes swamps.
The Great Swamp was saved, but it's not safe, and it's not safe from the outside influences. The swamp itself is protected, it's a refuge, but it's impacted negatively by what's going on in the surrounding watershed, by land use changes. Some of them are perfectly acceptable legal changes. It's just that you need to develop wisely.
If you look at how the colonials treated it, it was simply something to be used with abandon. Then it sort of reaches the height of abandonment when the Port Authority was ready to simply pave it over as if it was wasteland. And then we see the complete turnaround when we recognize it as not only a natural landscape, but as wilderness that's worth saving for its own sake, even if you never walk into it.
We were lucky to have bought that little house where we lived for many years. The children loved the brook. They loved living there. They loved the trees and the forest behind us. So yes, they had a wonderful childhood.
It's still there.
It's still there. It's still there. It's still there.